Hi, welcome to Mend. I'm Julie. Today on Mend we have Bernie Fette. Hi, Bernie.
Hi,
Welcome.
thank you.
Thank you for being on here today.
I'm glad to be.
So we are here October 2nd, and this is not when we will be airing this, but it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
Right.
And I would like to, obviously talk about that with you. But first, I'd like to know a little bit about how you were raised and maybe when you started understanding mental health, and just to know a little bit more about your background.
That's a great start. It was just very what I would call plain. I had two older brothers. My mom and dad. We had a what I would call a middle class house, middle class upbringing. My dad was the editor and owner of the local newspaper. It was a small town newspaper, which is probably where I got the genetic start for my own writing activity. But anyway, my life as a child and then into my teen years was what I would call very plain. But later in life, I think that I came to understand it as being in a very healthy environment. There was no drama. I mean, there was a little sibling drama between me and two older brothers, of course. But in terms of just serious disruption and what I learned later in life constitutes domestic abuse, domestic violence, and all of the mental health components or issues that go along with domestic violence. I think that what I finally realized that when I was growing up, I was in a healthy environment, and so what I know now about robust mental health and good mental health, I learned largely by witnessing what poor mental health looked like.
We're here because we are talking about domestic violence, and so your story is, and what you went through is very important. And then I don't think I've ever spoken with anybody who has grown up in a home where, for the most part, there just wasn't a lot of, violence before the violence happens, I guess I should say.
Right, right.
And so it sounds like you didn't see any of that, and things were, just pretty steady for you growing up.
Things didn't get really eventful until later in life, whenever I got married at age 25.
Okay.
My wife at the time was just a few months older than me, so we were roughly the same age. That was in 1984, and we were married in 1985, and things were very, what I would call pleasant, healthy for the most part. I did see some warning signs very early on, and I ignored them.
What were those signs?
The signs that I noticed first were just what I would call explosive reactions to things, explosive reactions to what I thought were minor disruptions in life and minor disagreements, and I just chalked it up to bad days. I made a lot of excuses, and I think that a lot of people who find themselves in abusive or violent relationships will make excuses and will make allowances, in part because we don't want to admit that we made mistakes, in part that because we don't want to admit that we are suffering. That's for the most part can be a very private thing, and I noticed warning signs like that, it wasn't too long after that that I started noticing the warning signs of what was just the beginning of drug use that became more frequent, more intense in terms of the degree of drug use, and more the problems that were abuse and violence related escalated along with the drug use.
Is this something that she had? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay, was she using drugs when y'all were when you had met, or in the early?
This was all prescription. I didn't even see prescription narcotics whenever I was growing up, because it was not something that was ever needed or used in my family growing up. So that was a little new, and as the use of those prescription medications became more common, the abusive situations became more frequent and more intense. That was not the only cause. There was a lot of trauma, I think would be the best way to describe it, that my ex-wife had in her own family. And that was one of the other things that started to, or that when I talked about recognizing good mental health by seeing poor mental health and having a point of comparison, that was a side of her background that I didn't know until after we were married. She grew up in a household that was as dramatic and as violent as mine was, just the opposite. Mm-hmm. And so I found myself in a very, in a place where I had nothing to compare it to. For me and the people I've talked to about this, that's a lot of the time the way that domestic violence and domestic abuse happens, is very, very slowly, until you realize that at some point you wake up and you realize just how trapped that you are. Yeah.
And I mean, growing up in a home where you weren't experiencing these things and being in a relationship, did your mind ever wonder, like, well, I'm sure some relationships are different, and so maybe this is just a little different than what I was used to?
Yes, and I was fed that by my abuser, that this is the way that marriages are, this is the way that everybody's marriage is, and the way that you grew up, that's not the norm. That's very, very odd for you to have had this idyllic, upbringing that didn't have strife in the house, didn't have strife in the family. So that's, and abusers, one of the tools that they use is gaslighting, and so they can make you try to make you believe that you're not really experiencing what you think you're experiencing. Mm-hmm. You're not really experiencing abuse. This is just life. And so the longer that you have that kind of a reinforcing position, or that kind of a reinforcing story from someone, without having anything from other people who can tell you things that can be much more healthy toward you, the greater chance that you're eventually going to believe the bad stuff, because that's what you're hearing all the time. That's the gaslighting is what you're hearing all the time.
Yeah, your friend Allison, who we had on here, she mentioned the same thing about gaslighting.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that popped out for in both of these conversations, is that really is something that will happen.
It is, and it can be very effective, and it's not the only tool.
Right.
Isolation is another really effective tool that abusers use, and that certainly was used effectively in my case. And when I say my case, the same goes for my son. He is 31 now, but he was around for a lot of what happened. And domestic violence in his case was that he was a victim also. And I think that another thing that people will hope for when they're in bad situations, bad relationships, unhealthy, abusive, violent relationships, that sometimes perhaps big changes might make things better. I believed that if we were to become parents, that would, redirect a focus toward a child, and raising a child in a responsible way, in a healthy way, and would perhaps take some of the pressure off. Those weren't thoughts in my mind before my wife became pregnant, but after, we knew that she was pregnant, that's where my brain went. I thought, well, maybe this will make other things better too. Almost in the same way that I thought later in life that perhaps a change in geography might make things better. But you're not really changing anything fundamental whenever those changes take place, because the underlying problem is still there.
Right. Mm.
It may be lurking in a slightly more concealed place, and it might even come out less frequently, but it's still there.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
So, did things? So, when your son was born, how long did it take before, she started to continue the abuse and for it to get worse? Was there a moment where your son was born and it did seem like things had settled down a bit, or is that
There
whenever-
was.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a period of years, and things between my son and his mom were what I thought for several years were actually healthy. And it wasn't until he got into junior high school that things started to get ugly for him too. They never really changed for me. The abuse still, was a regular part of life for me, but it wasn't for him until he got into junior high school, and then it worsened as he got into high school.
Can you tell me what abuse looked like for you?
What abuse looked like for me was, it started out as verbal, emotional, degrading. You're lucky to have what you have, was the message that was coming to me. You're lucky that I would have you. You're lucky that that I'm willing to put up with you. You're lucky that no one else would have you. You're lucky that I would have you. And that kind of, I guess, progressed to just more hateful things. I don't want to use the exact language, but you're just an effing man. What do you know? And there was a lot of talk like that. That was the beginning of it, but eventually it became more physically violent. Primarily just things that were thrown at me, a lot of things that were broken. Some people would raise their voices to make a point. If she really wanted to make a point, she would throw a glass against the wall or into the sink or smash a big plate glass window. These are all things that eventually became fairly common. the less, I guess what you would call less dramatic ways that when you ask what did domestic violence look like for me, a lot of the worst parts had to do with isolation. She was extremely skillful at separating me from my two brothers. My dad had passed away years before, but I still had a relationship with my mom. And my ex-wife was very skilled at separating me from them. And that's another one of those things that would happen very, very slowly. But eventually it got to a point where we just never made trips at holidays, or never made trips for any kind of visits to either my brothers or to my mom. And even whenever later in life, when my mom was in an assisted living facility and was losing her own ability to function and to even recognize people, my clearance, if you want to call it that, to make trips to go visit her was extremely limited. I had to put up a pretty big fight to go to see her. In fact, one of the worst experiences that I had in that regard, in the way of isolation, was whenever she died, and I was trying to break free of my home just for a day to go to her funeral. And I was called all kinds of names. I was called a hypocrite. How can you possibly go back to that place and that church? You don't believe those things. You know, you're just an effing hypocrite. And it was there. So the isolation was a big part of what domestic violence looked like to me. Another big part of what domestic violence looked like for me was when the drug use, the prescription drug use, got a lot worse. And then if you go to the same emergency room hours later or days later, to a different emergency room hours later or days later, they can call up your record and know where you were, what your treatment was, what your ailment was, etc. But before the age where that was all possible, you could go shopping. And we did a lot of shopping. I would be put in the position of being the assistant in a way, or the enabler in a sense, because I would, she would say, "You better back me up on this."
Well, yeah, and you knew you had to, or there'd be hell to pay.
That's exactly. If I had a choice to make, I could back her up and tell the nurses and tell the emergency room doctors, yes, she's in horrible pain. It's been going on for this amount of time. Whatever story she fed to me that I was supposed to in turn convey to the medical people. I could do that, or there would be, as you said, hell to pay when we got out. The anxiety was extremely high in those situations, and the same thing, in only a slightly different way, would happen on the way to her doctor's office, to her primary care doctor's office. And this is when I started to realize, I started to understand a little bit more about the question you had earlier about what mental health looks like. Because her primary care physician would emphasize, as he wrote her prescriptions for pretty large amounts of narcotic pills, that he expected her to work on the psychological issues that he felt were contributing to her physical state and her physical pain. Mm. And so there was that expectation on his part, but that attempt for her to try and address that side of her health needs was never she never carried it out.
I see.
So I was witnessing that defiance, and as a result, she never sought the help that she really needed to, in order to deal with the demons of, you know, her earlier years.
From from what I understand, they usually don't think there's anything wrong with them. It's something's wrong with everybody else.
Right.
And so,
Yeah.
when she started, when you, at this point, when you're taking her to the hospital or to the doctor, how was your son of his teenage years, or was that before then, or?
It was before.
Okay.
It started before. Those trips again became a lot more difficult to execute as when hospitals and doctors' offices became more wired together.
Okay.
It became a lot more difficult to make those trips and to make them successfully meeting for her to get the drug treatment that she was asking for.
I see. So then there came a point when she's becoming physically abusive to your son, and you did not see this coming. And
Most of it I did not see it coming, and I didn't know about most of it until he told me about it, and he didn't tell me about most of his experiences, most of his abuse experiences, until we were both out, until we had both moved out,
okay.
which happened about a little over 5 years ago, about 5.5 years ago.